Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari, and we got a little bit of a different setup. It's just kind of the camera's further across the room because I've moved my desk right here. So you probably know this from the title. I hope you know this from the title. I'm talking about Mistborn: The Final Empire, which is the first book in the Mistborn series, because I'm currently doing a reread of the entire series because The Lost Metal, which is the 7th book in the series, is coming out in November. So I am reading one book a month, and I will do a video on each book, which is going to go really into detail with these books and what you need to know, what you might have missed, hopefully like explaining some things that maybe you didn't catch. Inherently, these videos are going to be spoilery, so if you haven't read the books, you're probably going to get spoiled on at least some small details, especially as the videos go along, because I can't just give you a plot for the first book if I'm doing a video on each book. This one, I'm gonna start out like less spoilery and spoiling like no major plot points, and then kind of get more spoilery as we go. If you have any questions or if I miss anything that you want explained, please feel free to leave it in a comment. And if there's anything that you feel like that's missing from this video that you would like to see in future videos, please let me know. My dog is snoring in the background. I don't actually know if you can hear that or not, but he is crazy snoring. Anyway, I also have this scripted out, which I don't normally do, so if you see me like staring over here, it's because I'm reading what I wrote, so I make sure I cover all the information I want to cover and not like forget something. So let's start off with, you know, the title, Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. It's either Mistborn or The Final Empire or Mistborn: The Final Empire. I believe on US covers it's just printed as Mistborn, and then on UK covers it's printed as The Final Empire. Let's be as confusing as possible, but I'm going to do my best to refer to it as Mistborn: The Final Empire and just cover all of the bases. In essence, this is a fantasy heist novel with a lot of interesting plot and interesting characters. Brandon Sanderson is the master of pacing. You're never going to feel bored reading any of his books. If you're new to Brandon Sanderson, Mistborn is a great place to start reading his work. If you want to start with a series instead of a standalone, I have a whole video on like where to start with Brandon Sanderson, and a bunch of other creators do as well. So each book in the series, at least the original trilogy, has its own purpose. There's a plot and a conclusion that is contained within the book that kind of like forwards itself as you go through the books. We're not going to set up a plot in Mistborn: The Final Empire that we're not going to solve until the Hero of Ages. The plot for Mistborn: The Final Empire is solved within Mistborn: The Final Empire, and then it expands to the next book as the characters learn some information that they didn't realize going into the first one, and then that expands into another book. But you're not going to like, oh, this is the outline of the plot of the book, and we're not going to get an answer to it until book 3. So there aren't any novels dedicated to just world building or character building with very little plot that you're going to find in here. And we're not going to see any middle book syndrome. But this is the first book, so we'll discuss middle book syndrome next time. So as I said earlier, each month I am reading one Mistborn book leading up to the release of The Lost Metal in November this year, which is 2022. I don't know what year it is. Feel free to read along with me. In June, we're reading The Well of Ascension, and I'm doing a video dedicated to each book, obviously starting with this one, and there will be spoilers in this video, as I said. Light at first, but full plot spoilers as we go into it later. I will warn you when there are full spoilers, or as like each level of spoilers kind of increases. But There will be minor spoilers while I'm trying to clarify the plot at the beginning of this. I highly recommend you read Mistborn, The Final Empire, before watching this video. Just an extra little disclaimer there. If you're leaving now, thank you so much for being here, and if you're sticking around, well, here we go. This book feels like you're starting in the middle of something and you're trying to catch up. Fortunately, the perspective character that we follow, Vin, is also being introduced to Alimancy, and we're learning right beside her. So it feels natural to learn because Vin's learning about it as well. 4 years, I'm not perfect on this timeline, but 3 or 4 years prior to the start of this novel, a man named Kelsier is running a specialized thieving crew in the capital of the Final Empire, which I believe is called Luthadel, but I'm not positive because I don't have that written in front of me right now. His goal was to steal etium, which is a very, very rare, very, very expensive metal from the Lord Ruler's palace. I hope the name Lord Ruler kind of identifies the Lord Ruler's role in this book. He is the God King, the Emperor, the Lord Ruler. Kelsier and his wife Mare are betrayed and caught breaking into the palace, and they're arrested and sent to a prison camp known as the Pits of Hathson, where Mare dies and Kelsier discovers he is a Mistborn. He unlocks his Alimantic powers, and then he escapes. Is from then on known as the Survivor of Hathson, and that title is kind of important to the plot of the story. So pay attention to how people treat Kelsier as the Survivor of Hathson. It'll help you understand the conclusion of this book better. I do want to mention here, just for clarification of the magic system, a person is born with the potential to use Alimantic powers, but they must suffer a near-death / extremely traumatizing experience in order to access those powers for the first time. So you can be born with Alimantic powers, but you have to go through some shit to be able to use your Alimantic powers for the first time, and then you can use them at will after that. But that is why Kelsier, as an adult man, had to go through the Pits of Hathson to find out he's a Mistborn. All of that information that I just gave you has taken place before the novel starts. And we kind of like pick up a little bit of this information as the novel continues, but you're not going to know that going in. That's just like a clarifying the background for people who've already read the novel. So the beginning of the novel, Kelsier has returned to Luthadel, and he is bringing together some old friends to create like the best thieving crew in the city in order to overthrow the Final Empire. So the first time he did this, he was just trying to steal the atium. Now he's like, we are going to overthrow the Final Empire. They're going to do this a bunch of ways, but the main focus of the plan is creating a ska army or a ska uprising and then taking over the city. And I'm going to explain what ska is and explain like all of the plans a little bit later in this video. So general background now, details later. At the beginning of the book, we meet Vin. She is a poor, weary street urchin who is at the bottom rung of a subpar thieving group. She is nothing special, and she is the bottom of nothing special in this thieving group. She is aware that she is extremely lucky, and she can like direct her luck if she concentrates enough, right? What she doesn't realize is her luck, as she calls it, is really Alimantic power. She's using trace amounts of brass and zinc found in like water supply or food that she's consuming to influence people's emotions, and then she uses pewter to fight off illness and injury when she's like beaten or just, you know, sick and malnourished. The fact that she's using brass, zinc, and pewter makes her a Mistborn, and I'll go into more detail about the difference between like Mistborn and Mistlings and how people can utilize this power later again. She is trained by Kelsier and his crew, but she also performs like the secondary duty of spying on the nobility as part of like their plan to overthrow the final empire. She pretends to be a woman named Valette Renault. Lord Renault is a nobleman working for Kelsier's crew. We find out interesting things about his background in the next book. You kind of get like a hint of it at the very end of this book, like there's something really not right with him. But his character is some people's like absolute favorite character going into book 2 and book 3. So pay attention to the weird things that he does, though they don't give a whole lot of hints to it in this book. And of course, this isn't a real fantasy without romance. So Vin indeed accidentally meets and falls in love with Ellen Venture, who is the heir to the most powerful noble house. Of course he is. Okay, from here I'm going to take some time to explain the world a little bit, and then introduce all of the important characters before I get back into like big spoilers and then like what you need to focus on going into the plot for book 2. Let's start with the world. This is set in a fantasy world reminiscent of like a dystopian universe. Ash is constantly falling from the sky. There's no such thing as green plants. They're all brown and like tiny, barely there, barely can feed people. And every night like this haunting mist covers the land, and people are really superstitious about like what goes on in this mist. You don't want to go out at night because of this mist. 1,000 years prior to the events of this book, a man named the Hero of Ages became a god, the immortal Lord Ruler, and this man's been alive for over 1,000 years. It's a chosen one gone bad trope, where he traveled to the Well of Ascension, repelled the deepness, and obtained his godhood. At this point in the story, we don't know what the deepness is exactly. We just know that as far as religion in this universe goes, that is the religion. You worship the Lord Ruler, and he has saved the world by repelling the deepness. I will tell you, we're going to figure out what the deepness is later, so don't stress about don't knowing that. It's important to plots in later books. Society is now divided between the nobility, who are supposedly the descendants of friends and allies of the Lord Ruler when he achieved his godhood, and the Ska, or SKAA. I don't know that that's pronounced Ska, but that's how I pronounce it. They're a slave-like, brutally oppressed peasant class. Like, imagine peons in a medieval time is how I picture them. Right now we don't know a lot of details of the origin of this society, but the Lord Ruler's history is explained in further books. So anything about the Final Empire that you read that doesn't really make sense or doesn't have a lot of background will be explained later. So I personally think the whole history of the Final Empire is really cool, and I could talk about it for days, but I'm not going to do that to you. Let's move on. Next, let's talk about the magic system. So the main magic that we're focused on, at least in book 1, is Alimancy. So some people are born with the potential to unlock Alimantic powers. They can swallow specific metals or alloys of those metals to gain access to one of 8 known Alimantic powers. This is where it kind of gets confusing, because technically there are 10 known Alimantic metals in this universe, but only 8 ones that like Mistlings can do. The extra 2 basically just belong to Mistborn, so they're not considered Mistling powers on their own. They're just metals that Mistborn can access in addition to the 8 basic powers. There are also more than 10, but 10 are only known during the bits of this book, if that makes sense. I'm going to go over the metals and their powers here in a minute, but let's talk about Mistborn and Mistlings first. So people either have access to 1 power, or all the powers, or none of the powers. There's no in between. If you're a Mistling, you don't have like 2 powers, you only have 1, or you have all of them and you're a Mistborn. I probably don't have to tell you this, but Mistborn are really, really rare. I should also note that technically speaking, only the nobility have access to unlock Alimantic powers. If there is a Ska Allomancer, they have noble parentage. Nobles can have sex with Ska women, but they are legally required to kill the women after they sexually assault them. So there are no Ska children born with the potential to have Alimantic powers. Obviously, I don't know if you caught that, that doesn't always happen. And the why of why nobles can have this power and Ska can't is explained in book 3, I think. Okay, let's talk about notable characters in this book. So we've already covered Vin, Kelsier, Mare, Elend, and the Lord Ruler. If you have any more questions about any of those people, let me know. The next person I'm going to talk about isn't really a character, but he's kind of important. His name is Reen, and he's Vin's missing brother. He's assumed to have abandoned Vin, and he was abusive, but he was also like all Vin ever had. The only family she's really ever had growing up. They have a very complicated dynamic, and Vin really doesn't have the ability to trust or love because of what her brother had done to her growing up. Next character we're going to talk about is Sazed. He's a Terraceman, which is a different race of people. Terracemen secretly have access to a different kind of magic called Furuukami. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. His people are bred to be like the perfect manservant, but Sazed is a rebel and part of Kelsier's band of thieves. His main role in this book is to teach Vin to be a lady and then to protect her. He's obsessed with religions, which is very, very important to the plot of later books, so make sure you pay attention to Sazed religions. It's kind of fun to go into the book and see all the stuff that Sazed says about religions and then to like apply it into book 3, because yeah, it's fun. You're just gonna have to trust me on it. We'll talk about Furuukami and stuff like that in much later books. It's not super explained in like the first trilogy, but it's more important in like Wax and Wane. So we're gonna breeze past that magic system for now, come back to it in a later video. Next character is Breeze, and he is a soother, who is someone who can manipulate people's emotions by burning brass. He comes across as lazy and likes tricking people into doing things for him with his soothing abilities, and his main task in this book is recruiting the Ska for Kelsier's army. Next up is Hammond, or Ham. He's a thug or a pewter arm. He burns pewter in order to enhance his physical abilities. Thugs are stereotypically like dumb brutes, but Ham is not this at all, and he likes to wax philosophically and debate people about philosophical arguments. He is one of the generals in charge of the army. Next up is Dachshund, who's Kelsier's best friend. Dachshund doesn't have any Alimantic powers, but he is amazing at organization. Then we have Clubs. He's a smoker who's a misting who burns copper to hide the use of allomancy from other allomancers. So since Ska aren't supposed to have access to Alimantic powers, having a smoker like Clubs is very, very important to any Ska allomancers, so the government can't find them and kill them. Clubs is a professional carpenter with a legitimate carpentry business that he uses as a front that serves as a secret base of operations for Kelsier and his crew. Then we have Lestiborns, or Spook, who is Club's nephew. Spook is a nickname that Kelsier gives him partway through the book because Lestiborns is a mouthful. He's a Tin-Eye who's a misting who burns tin to enhance their senses, making him like a really, really great lookout. He is the youngest member of the crew, and he also speaks in something called Eastern Street slang, which is a fun, nonsensical language. Spook is my favorite character. This symbol on my arm right here is the symbol for 10, which I got in honor of Spook. And I encourage you to pay attention to his growth throughout the books. He's like a really, really background character in this first book, but he gets really important in book 3. I don't know, I just love him. He's my favorite. Then we have Lord Renault. He's just a nobleman who supports the plot to overthrow the final empire. He's got a lot more depth than just being a nobleman, but book 2 for that information. Then we have Yeden, I don't actually know how to pronounce his name. He's the leader of the Ska Rebellion, and he is the person who technically hires Kelsier to put together this crew to overthrow the final empire. He's not an Alimancer. And probably one of my least favorite characters. But then we have Marsh, who's Kelsier's brother. He used to lead the Ska Rebellion, and he's a seeker, which is an Alimancer who can detect other alchemancers. So basically, Club's job is to hide the gang from seekers like Marsh. Marsh's job in this book is really to infiltrate the Steel Ministry. We don't learn a lot about that in this book, but we will later. Speaking of the Steel Ministry, that is the priesthood and bureaucracy of the final empire. Obligators are common officials, while Steel Inquisitors are basically like the SWAT team, the magical SWAT team. They're creepy with metal spikes driven through both of their eyeballs and extremely powerful Mistborn abilities. Like Kelsier and Vin are Mistborn, but the Steel Inquisitors are like way above and beyond better Mistborn. The Lord Prelan is the head obligator, and he's also Vin's father, which is why she's such a powerful Mistborn. There are 4 cantons that we know of as far as like how the government's set up. You've got the canton of Inquisition, which is the policing branch, the canton of Orthodoxy, which is organizational, the canton of Research, which is like the taxing branch, and then there's a canton of Finance, which it never actually explains anywhere in the book what they do. We just know that a canton of Finance exists. Now let's talk about Alimantic Metals. So the metals come in like groups or pairs: internal, external, pushing, pulling, physical, and mental. There are 10 known metals at the time of the final empire, with 8 known different types of mistings plus Mistborn, right? There are 12 known metals by the end of the book, but at the beginning, 8 mistings, 10 metals, 12 metals at the end of the book. And right now the series has 6 books. There are 19 known metals at the current point in the series. A lot of them we don't figure out until Era 2 of Mistborn, but just know that they're still discovering metals as the series goes through. So basically all I'm going to do is talk about the 12 metals known about in the books and the name of the misting associated with them. First we have physical metals, and we're going to start with steel, which are coin shots, and iron, which are lurchers. So steel pushes metal away from you. So if you're standing here, you can push all the metal around you away from you, while lurchers pull metal towards them. So if you're standing in a circle, you can pull all the metal towards you, right? Then tin were tin eyes, and pewter are thugs. So tin enhances all 5 of your senses. So eyesight, sense of smell, sense of hearing, sense of touch. You got really sensitive. You can feel all your clothes on you. It's got, you know, pros and cons. And when you burn tin, you enhance all of your senses at once, not just like you can pick and choose which sense to enhance. Pewter arms, thugs, they have different names. It enhances your physical capabilities. So your strength, like you've got more strength, your ability to survive bodily damage, your endurance, and your balance. Further, we're going to go into mental metals. So you've got bronze, which are seekers, and copper for smokers. Bronze, or people burning bronze, can tell if someone is using allomancy. And then people burning copper can hide Alimancy from other, or can hide the Alimancy use from seekers. Both of them are dependent on the immediate area. I don't know why area was so hard for me to say. Then we have zinc users, who are rioters, and brass users, which are soothers. So zinc inflames emotions and brass dampens emotions. So if you're trying to make somebody happy, you can do it two ways. You can either use zinc to just riot and like increase that happy emotion, or you can use brass to soothe all of the other emotions other than being happy, where happy is still the most important emotions, or you can do both. So those are the 8 basic metals that we know of so far, and their equivalent misting name. We're going to talk about the 3 other metals that are talked about in this book that at the point of this book we don't have mistings for. So atium, which I kind of mentioned earlier, it's a really, really expensive metal. It's expensive because it allows Mistborn to see a few seconds into the future. The next up is gold, which there's like a scene in the book about gold. It's not really understood what it is in this book, but I'm going to share with you what it does, and it just allows you to see another version of yourself. Like if you would have made a decision in the past that changes you as a person, that's the other person that you could have become. And that's all gold does. Sounds kind of useless, right? Then there's the 11th metal, which is not named in the book, but it's called Palladium. It shows 2 versions of another person. Basically, it's gold and atium mixed together. Instead of showing what you could have become, it shows what other people around you could have become in 2 versions of themselves. So the version they are now and the version that could have been. Kelsier believes throughout this book that this 11th metal is what's going to defeat the Lord Ruler if it's used in his presence. So that's kind of like, he's tested it out. He can't really figure out what it's done, but he knows that if he takes this and burns it in the presence of the Lord Ruler, that it's going to be able to kill the Lord Ruler. That's like his working theory throughout the book. I also want to note that Vin is forced to consume a metal at the very end of the book by the Steel Inquisitors that kind of like drains away or destroys all of her metal reserves in her stomach. This metal isn't named, but it's aluminum or aluminium, depending on if you're American or British. I'm American, so I'm going to call it aluminum. But yeah, that is more important, like later in the books. Next section is going to be really, really big on spoilers. So if you haven't read the book yet, you plan to ever read this book and you're still here, now is the time for you to go. Thank you for being here through this point. So, the plan for the group is to destabilize the city, kill the immortal Lord Ruler, and overthrow the final empire. In order to fund the new empire that they're creating, they also plan to steal the Lord Ruler's atium. That's also how they're gonna like fund their, work that they're doing. To do this impossible task, they break it up into less impossible tasks, but still kind of impossible. Starting with those tasks, the noble houses sometimes go to war, and the gang feels like it's a good time to start a new war. Easy, just start a war in the noble houses. Kelsier, Vin, Sazed, and Renault are kind of like the main players for executing that step. They also plan to recruit Ska into the resistance, building and training an army that will take over the small city garrison and hold the city. So Ham, Yedin, Clubs, and Breeze are mainly focused on like recruitment and training of the army. Marcia's goal is to infiltrate the Steel Ministry, and the final step, killing the immortal Lord Ruler, Kelsier says he's handled. And he doesn't really explain how the hell he's going to handle it to anybody. He's just like, no, I got it. Don't worry about it. That's the most... that's the hardest step. That's the most impossible step. And Kelsier's just like, yeah, no, I got it. Don't worry. It's easy. Don't even think about it. Although these are the plans, obviously these individual plans vary in success. The nobility is driven to war pretty easily, and there's only like a few hiccups in that plan execution, but that's the one that like works really, really well. The army is recruited, but Yeden does some really dumb shit and gets most of the army killed. While not ideal, they do succeed in getting the city garrison out of the city, which was the goal of the army. Just more of them were supposed to survive than did. Marsh does infiltrate the ministry, but he is discovered and his body is missing. He's assumed dead because of all the blood in the room. We do know that Marsh survives and becomes a Steel Inquisitor at the end of the book, which is more important like later in the series. And Marsh is going to help identify like a lot of really interesting stuff further books. And then killing the Lord Ruler obviously does not go as planned, and Kelsier ends up dead instead. So this really shows that Brandon Sanderson is willing to kill off his main character, which is going to hurt you later. The gang finds out that Kelsier never really planned to kill the Lord Ruler. His plan was to become a martyr and enable the Ska through worshipping him throughout the book to finally rise up and overthrow the government. Even if the Lord Ruler doesn't die, he still thinks that if all of the peasant class rises up because they now worship him as a god or a martyr, they'll still be able to, you know, do the thing. Then does not handle Kelsier's death well. You can imagine. She finally has friends and loves people after all the shit that her brother put her through, and then one of them martyrs himself. She does not handle this well. So she makes her own attempt to kill the Lord Ruler, and there's some pretty wild reveals at the end of this book, but she succeeds. As we go into book 2, Elend is crowned king, and he's set up ruler as this new democratic government. And then no ATM is found, so the government is extremely poor, which is important for the next book. This last section is basically just important things for us to note going further into the series. So at the head of every chapter reading through this book, there are journal entries from the Journal of the Hero of Ages, who we assume is the current Lord Ruler. Vin and Sazed actually find this exact journal at some point in this book, and Sazed translates it all for the gang. So it's introduced from early on, from like first chapter, but the whole thing is actually eventually discovered at some point in the book. The Lord Ruler seems like a completely different man in the 1,000 years since his ascension of godhood, because he's a completely different person that wrote that journal. The Lord Ruler is a former Terrace packman and guide for Alendi, who was the man who wrote the journal. So basically what had happened is Alendi is a man who is destined to be the hero of ages. He's a man of prophecy. He's traveling to the Well of Ascension and writing this journal as he goes along. One of the guides that he has is this man named Rashik. The end of his journal ends, and then he goes into the well. What we don't realize until the end of the book is that Rashik kills Alendi before he can take the power in their Will of Ascension, and then claims the power for himself. This background story of like the hero of ages and stuff like that is important going into the further books, because we're going to see some of this prophecy like moving on. We're going to find out a whole lot more about like why Rashik did all of this in either the end of book 2 or book 3. It's been a while since I've reread these books, so I can't remember exactly like where some of these major plot points are contained. Vin's earring is often mentioned, but it is far more important than the plot makes it seem so far. So pay attention to what's happening on page anytime Vin's earring is mentioned. It's kind of a cool device that you're gonna be like, oh. Written word and what Sage researches and translates is very central to the plot. So if you've got a good memory, pay attention to that. Lord Renault, I mentioned him earlier. He's a Khandra, which is introduced at the end of the book. His story is really interesting. Like I said, he's a lot of people's favorite character, so pay attention to the Khandra going forward. You'll note the spikes in the Steel Inquisitor's face, and then some other creatures that we're going to be introduced to in future books have spikes. This is another interesting magical device that will be much more important going into Era 2. I mean, it's important for like this series, but it's also important going into Era 2. And that's everything I've got to talk about. If you have any questions, comments, whatever, let me know down in the comments below. If you have reread this or read it for the first time this month, let me know. I want to know who's reading along with me. I will have another video up either at the very end of June or early July for The Well of Ascension, because that's the next book that I'm going to read. And that's pretty much it. See you in the next video. Bye.